Earlier we learned about composting and what exactly we have to add into the compost pile in order to make this process happen properly. The ingredients are greens, browns, water, air, and living organisms. Now it's time for us to get outside and practice identifying greens versus browns and even set up our own mini compost experiment in a jar. In this activity, you will need something to collect your example items with. You might also want to get some clippers for harvesting, and of course, you will need your iPad to take photos with. If you plan to participate in the optional second part of this activity, you will also need a durable clear container with holes poked in the top, a little bit of water, and a small scoop of soil. Remember that part 2 is optional, which means that you don't have to do it unless you and your ohana really want to do it, just as a fun, extra way of taking your learning even further. To start the activity, go outside and search for 3 example items to fit into each category, greens and browns. 3 greens and 3 browns. Remember, greens need to be things that come from living organisms, usually plants, that are fresh and still have moisture in them. You could look for fresh clippings to take from your yard, and you might also want to wait until you have some kitchen scraps, like fruit peels, eggshells, or coffee grounds. You can use those for this category too. The second category is browns. For this section, look for once living matter that used to be alive, but now is fully crispy, crunchy, and dry, and maybe has even turned the color brown. This is things like dried leaves, old grass cuttings, and even shredded paper. Once you have your example items, head over to Seesaw and fill out the worksheet. Page 1 of the worksheet is for people who were able to do this activity with real physical examples that they went out to go and find, and page 2 is for any haumana who need a virtual-only activity. Choose which version you are going to do and follow all of the directions to complete it. Take photos of the example items for each category, or use the photos provided, and then sort your pictures into the correct category, greens or browns. When you're done sorting, use words through writing or recording to tell why each item fits into that category. You need to finish the sentences, "These items are greens because," and "These items are browns because." Select the provided text box, delete the 3 dots, and then use your own describing words to tell the end of that sentence. Remember that greens and browns don't just fit into their category because of their color. What other qualities did we learn in the lesson that determine which category an item belongs to? What kinds of traits can you observe or notice that let you know which category you should put your items into? When you are all done sorting your items and filling out your sentences, you have completed your work and you are ready to submit it. But wait! If you want to take this activity even further, there's a second part that you can do. This part too is completely optional, but it's a fun experiment that you can do at home to get to see the decomposition and composting process happen up close and personal. For this activity, we will be building our own mini compost pile in a jar. You will use the example items that you collected for part 1 of the activity, but you'll also need a lot more browns and a lot more greens if you plan to do this experiment. After you finish your worksheet in part 1, gather up the rest of your materials and start to layer them in the jar. First, add a layer of soil from the ground outside. We have to add this in because soil is filled with living organisms, fungus, bacteria, and invertebrates. They are critical to making the composting process happen. Next up, start layering your greens and browns. I am using a variety of different kinds of greens and browns so that over time I can observe how they all break down and compare and contrast which items break down faster than others. For greens, I'm putting in things like clippings from the garden and food scraps from the kitchen. For browns, I'm putting in dried leaves, shredded up paper, and a little bit of broken down wood chips. The very last step is to add a little bit of water. Moisture is critical to making sure that the composting process happens. But if you put too much, your compost will get stinky and smelly. Just put enough so that the ingredients are damp but not soaking. You should not see water pooling and collecting at the bottom of your container. If you do, pour the extra out. Over time, you also need to make sure that your container doesn't get completely dried out. And if necessary, you might have to add in a little bit more water as the experiment goes on. Now your compost in a jar is all set to go. Cover it up and leave it in a safe place for 10 to 12 weeks. I've provided a tracking worksheet for those of you who decide to do this activity so that you can be able to keep track of how your compost in a jar evolves over time. You can find the worksheet on Seesaw, and every time you update the worksheet, just save it as a draft by using the orange check mark so that you will be able to add to it again next time. Every single week, you should take a photo and share some observations about what has changed in your jar. Hopefully, in 10 to 12 weeks, you will have something that looks like finished compost.